bottom bracket is an internal or an external set of bearings, there's an easy sign of usually the first thing you're going to hear is some creaking as you pedal. You may hear a fairly defined crack with each pedal stroke. One way to check that your bottom bracket is on its way, or how worn it is to check for play in the bottom bracket itself, reflected in the movement in the crank arms. Clearly the crank arms want to go round and round, but what they don't want to do is move in and out. If I grab the crank arm as part of my regular bike safety check before my ride and move in and out, you can feel for some play there. This one has got a fairly distinct amount of play in it. It can get to an extent where that play will be enough for it to drop off the chain rings. This one is ready for change, hasn't started dropping the chain yet, but it's certainly time to go. So, as well as our chain cassette, we're also going to be replacing our BB. We'll start at the front with the BB, and we're going to look at the internal type, the old school type of BB we will find on lower end bikes and older bikes. Tend to last a bit longer than the externals, but can be a bit more fiddly to change. First things first, we can't get to any of it without removing the cranks. Again, more modern crank systems, easier to take off. This is an old school square taper pin. It's going to be a bit harder to get out, but no drama if you've got the right kit. We're going to start with the non-drive side and go from there. So with a freshly cleaned bike after your ride, having identified the need to change it, first thing we're going to have to do is take out that crank bolt. And that will be an 8mm, hopefully. Quite simply, you place your large 8mm Allen key in the hole and you start to unwind. Can be a bit stiff to start with, you might need to get a bit of leverage on it and use the crank arm to pull in. Here, it's not too bad, away we go. Once we've started that motion, unwinding motion, we should be able to do it with less leverage and a bit more speed. And out she comes. There's our bolt, nicely removed, keep that nice and safe. And now it's down to getting the crank arm off. Okay, so we need to make sure we've got the right tool for the job. This piece of kit here winds in, screws in with the same thread as the crank bolt, and once it's wound nice and tightly in, we start to wind the handle, the plunger comes out, and it literally pushes the crank arm off. There is only a certain size hole in there. If that doesn't fit in that hole, you need to be very careful. The most common mistake you can make here is not tightening up the outer into the thread far enough, and as you start to try and remove the crank arm, it threads the whole crank arm. So be very careful, make sure that is nicely tight. So we're going to wind it in by hand to start with. And then once it's in far enough with the hand, we're going to tighten it up further using a spanner. It shouldn't require too much force. If it does so, it could be that the plunger doesn't fit through your crank arm, so be very careful there. That's come off quite freely. Stage one. Now we're going to flip the bike around and repeat the operation the other side. Only difference this side is obviously we've got lots of gubbins in the way of the chain and the derailleur. So the first thing I'm going to do is get the neck out of the way, get the chain out of the way, dropping it off the bottom ring. Now I'm just going to unhinge it and hang it around the outside of the bottom bracket so it's out of the way. Find the 8mm. And start the process again. Having removed our cranks, it's now time to start work on getting the old BB out. Now you'll see in a minute that the bottom bracket comes in two parts. There's a cup in one side and the main BB unit the other side, and they wind into the frame, forming a nice tight bond, keeping your bearings nice and tight, giving you a nice strong axle, etc. This can be quite hard work, especially when the bottom BB's been in there a while. So expect some blood, sweat and tears. I'm going to push this piece in here on the cup side, which is the non-drive side. And once that's in place, I'm going to get a spanner around there and work its way around. what you want to do is make sure that the teeth are correctly engaged, fully engaged in there before you start trying to turn. Otherwise you can burr them over and it becomes very difficult then, once they're burred, to get the unit out. This one not proving too difficult, almost like we prepared it, which we didn't. After a few turns, you've got a good grip, you should be able to do it without the spanner. There's your cup, and you get to see what's happening in there with the BB. We'll spin it round, and we'll do the other side. We'll flick the chain out of the way. Before you get very upset, sweat a lot, graze your fingers, break your tools, and smash your bottom bracket up. Remember that this side is a reverse thread. So rather than righty-tighty, we're going the other way. Out she comes. You can start to see just how worn all of that was and how messed up all the bearings was. A lot of grit and dirt gets in there and starts to wear things out. And inside here is invariably going to be pretty full of the terrain that you usually ride. In this case, quite a lot of sand in there. So before I put the new one in, I'm going to give it a good clean out. Once you've extracted your BB, the really important thing is to make sure you're getting the correct size to put back in. There are various numbers pertaining to the size of the bottom bracket. One refers to the case width, and that'll either be 9 times out of 10 68 rather, or 73, and the other is the spindle length, and there'll be 3 or 4 different sizes there, 113, etc. So by cleaning up the old one, marked on it is what this was. In this case, a 68 113. As luck would have it, I knew that, so I've got the correct one to replace. Nice new bottom bracket, all greased up and all lubed up. Probably a good idea to put a bit of grease in the shell. Obviously your hands are protected by some nice latex gloves if you're doing this a lot. So we're going to put the drive side in first. Remembering of course that was a nice reverse thread. Making sure it's seated correctly and you're not cross threading it at this stage, which will mess things up royally. I want to get that in nice and tight. I'm putting that side in first because the cup side might not go all the way back in. If I put the cup side in first and put it all the way in, I might not get my BB in properly. That is now nicely seated in. On the flip side, we're going to put the cup in. Again, a little bit of grease on there is going to smooth the process. Line her up, and this should be standard thread. Good to go. Let's get the crank arms back on. We've got ourselves a nice firm, well seated, well correctly fitted, brand new BB, which should give us some several hundred miles of trouble-free pedalling. So it's to get the crank arms back on. Much more simple than the extraction. We're just going to place them over the axle in the right place and put them into place with our crank arm bolts. If you're not replacing your chain at the same time, which you're not always going to be by any means, a couple of things to remember. One is to get your chain back around the BB so it's in place to put back in place. And secondly, gravity is going to make your arms both hang down. So having avoided schoolboy error number 1 of forgetting to put the chain around the chain rings before we put the crank arm back on, schoolboy error number 2 is to make sure we don't end up the 2 cranks hanging down or half cocked, making sure they're opposite each other nicely, and away we go and tighten. If you've got a torque wrench, there'll be some guidelines on how tight that bolt should be. If you're without such a device, work on the rule that it needs to be pretty damn tight. You don't want your cranks falling off.